There she is. Yeah, I mean, I'll go
Well, let's do that in preparation for my trip. I'm very open to plans, kind of stuff like that. Yeah, it's but there's two accounts happening. One of them has to do with, of course, the United States bill. The other is that we're already doing a major internship program. We're ramping it up to make sure that the MBA students are tracked into U.S. and Ukraine businesses. They will also have Western models of business management, and they'll be able to go right from school through their internships, just like they do here in the United States, with businesses there. Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually going to come back and I'll be in the next couple of weeks in partners. Yes, I know he is, but he's going to be back and be there at the end of this month. And so as soon as he's back, we need Morgan and Paul Thomas, who is now the special advisor to the director for business engagement, and he's going to be the editor of the business journal, the University of Michigan. A lot of different
it's okay. I mean, it's easy to do.
It's dirty.
I'm trying to make things happen.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We have two excellent panels, all-star lineup on the state of Ukraine's energy sector. The first panel is on hydrocarbons. The second panel is on just about everything else. We are able to put on this event with the support of our partner in Ukraine, Corporation SCM. You can follow us at #FutureUkraine. I am notorious for not describing our speakers because I want to get them to speak. You have excellent bios on pieces of paper which are available to everyone. But our first panel will be moderated by Bud Coote, but will also include Ambassador Dick Morningstar, Steve Nicandros, the CEO of Frontera, and Olga Bielkova, who's a member and deputy chairperson of the Committee on Fuel and Energy Complex, Nuclear Policy and Nuclear Safety in the Rada. She'll be with us remotely, which is why we have our screen on. With that, I'll invite our panel to come up, and I'll get out of the way. Thank you very much for coming.
Do we have the Skype person?
We do. There she is. Hello, Olga. Can you hear us? Hi. We can see you now and hear you now. Okay, great. Okay, well, we have a very distinguished panel here to discuss Ukraine hydrocarbons. To my left, Chairman of the Board of Frontera, Steve Nicandros, Richard Morningstar from the Atlantic Council, Director of the Global Energy Group and founding director. And from Ukraine, we have Olga Bykolov, a member of the Rada and deputy chairperson of the Committee on Fuel and Energy Complex and Nuclear Policy and Nuclear Safety. And Olga, I'd like to start with you. This is a panel on hydrocarbons. Ukraine's hydrocarbons, in particular gas, have been growing upstream in recent years. And I'd like you to address that progress and the role of the Rada in hydrocarbon development and the potential and opportunities you see for further progress and what your priorities are in the Rada to achieve that progress.
We made some progress, but I still think that there is a lot of other issues which have to be done. So let me just quickly tell you what was already done. Back in 2013 and 2015, the government is making, along with the Rada, we've made very crucial decision of increasing of sale gas for households. You would say it's a distant decision from the overall market, but it was actually a very crucial one, because then UGV, our largest producer of gas, which is producing currently about 75% of the overall production, about 13.5 BCM on an annual basis. And that's a company which is actually selling gas to the households for their needs. They've got fair, reasonably fair conditions for their activities, which set the stage for all of us to hope that Ukraine at some point will be able to reach their plan, which is called Ukraine 2020, which means that they want to produce 20 BCM instead of 13.5 by 2020. Along with them, there are about 6-7 private major producers. When I say major, I mean in terms of Ukraine. Those companies are producing about they are producing about 25% of the overall production in Ukraine. And for them, this change meant that the market rules will be competitive. The cabinet of ministers will not be able to take their gas away and sell it at, let's say, non-market price. So that was done, the political decision and the law decision was done back 2015, 2016. We still need to adjust UGV's price. The price which is a price they use to calculate tariffs for household producers, we still need to move it closer to market price. But
The first, most important and painful step was done. Then we passed the law on gas market, which you are all aware of. Then next year, in 2016, we as RADA passed legislation which will leave share of revenues with local authorities, which is one of the strongest impediments for gas companies to work in the regions, be it private or state-owned companies. But this law will be in effect as of 1st of January 2018. But the issues remain unresolved are land issues and the overall regulation issues around gas production. We have about 44 permits which each company has to get, and it takes about 2 years. I don't want to scare you, but some companies say to me 2 years to get all the permits and licenses. And then, of course, you have one of the companies on the panel who is interested in coming and working in Ukraine, but realistically, when they come to me and they ask, Olga, who do I go to get new licenses? I don't have clarity on that one. So the whole issue of how do we issue licenses, how do we share geological information, who does it, at which price, how open, how transparent, is still unresolved. We've showed slight progress. We've increased about 3 to 4% annually from 2016 to 2017. That is to say we are not in bad shape. But once again, I expect from my government to support me on some of my initiatives to change the fiscal conditions for new companies to come and start more drilling and to do more accelerated development of gas. This is like a slight overview, small overview. I'm not sure I answered all your questions, but please go ahead and clarify what is missing.
Well, I'm going to come back to you, but there is, so don't go away. But there is one quick question I would like to ask you. You say that the residential price for gas, for domestic gas, is still different from the industrial price, is correct? Are you working on unifying that price? And when might you expect that to be accomplished?
We are working on this process. I just came back from the meeting of our political fraction and cabinet of ministers and prime minister. And prime minister was introducing budget resolution for the next half of the year. And in it, he gave very serious observation of what is happening with the subsidies. As you may know, the price which is used to calculate the tariffs for heating and gas for households will then influence how many people will need subsidies. As of now, we estimate that just in this year, in 2017, the government will need about 70 billion hryvnias to cover the subsidies for gas, heating, and other utilities. That's a huge amount, which is comprised not only of current year accounts, but some balance left over from the previous year. So while we all agree that Ukraine should move to 100% market price for households, other countries in our region took also deliberate approach of approaching this price. So I encourage my government to do it as fast as they can, but I also understand their constraints in the budget because they do depend on the impact on subsidies.
Okay, very good. Well, I want to get our other panelists into the discussion. So, Steve, I'd like you to address Ukraine's hydrocarbon development, including its resource potential for further growth, from the perspective of a businessman and comment on the investment risks, the obstacles you see, and what further reforms and actions you think might help hydrocarbon growth in the future.
Very good. Thank you, Bud. It's a pleasure to be here today. First, let me say that the overview that Olga gave really represents, I think, why upstream companies like mine, we're a Houston, Texas-based oil and gas company. We work in Eastern Europe. Why directionally Ukraine is a country of the future in Europe to come and start working today. And we see dynamic changes in government. We see reforms that are being put in place in terms of the marketplace. It's not perfect, as she highlighted, but nothing really is. But the most important thing is the will of the government to directionally make changes. And I think we've seen that over a number of years as we've progressed to today. For our company, we are applying for licenses in the country because we see Ukraine as, in the upstream sector, a very attractive country to work. And why is that? I want to kind of set the table for you. Because too often these discussions spiral down to what's wrong and what reforms and regulations we need to change, et cetera. But the fundamental reason that we want to be there, and I think a lot of companies need to be there, is that Ukraine has giant oil and gas resource potential that has gone untapped now for many years for a variety of reasons. And to put it in perspective for you, in the mid-'70s, Ukraine was producing annually 70 billion cubic meters of gas. Today, the country produces roughly about 20 billion cubic meters. But what's per year. But what's really interesting about that is if you look at the production curve from the mid-'70s, you see from the mid-'70s till, let's say, the early '80s, a very steep drop-off in production and then flat of 20 BCM per year until today. And for explorers and earth scientists that understand how reservoirs produce, that decline is not natural. It's not a natural decline that comes from the reservoir. It's a decline that comes from above the ground in terms of lack of investment, lack of modern technology applications, and lack of an active industry that is exploiting year on year very aggressively. And so that represents opportunity that allows companies like us to say that we believe that we can see that production curve climb back up way above 20 BCM per year in the next 5 to 10 years if enough investment and companies like us can be brought to the forefront. Similarly, on the oil side, back around 2006, 2007, Ukraine was producing a little more than 30,000 barrels a day, I believe, of oil. Today, the country produces 30,000 barrels a day. Did I say 30? It was about 60,000 barrels a day, and today is about 30,000 barrels. Again, that gap is not because of depletion. That gap is because of a lack of investment, lack of more modern technological applications, and it represents an opportunity for upstream investment in the country. When you look at that potential to get from 20 BCM a year back to 70, or from 30,000 barrels a day above 60, above 70, this is the potential that we see there. We see publications in the public domain that say Ukraine has untapped potential of more than 5 trillion cubic meters of gas in conventional sources, and more than twice that in unconventional sources. And so when you set the table with that information, it's not difficult at all to see Ukraine providing not only for itself over the next decade, but becoming a major exporter of energy into Europe, and helping to drive European energy prices down so that consumers can have cheaper energy and have a positive impact on the European economy in general. So, you know, how does this happen? I mean, it's, as I said, you know, upstreamers tend to be optimists by nature to go and explore, and we do see the landscape in Ukraine is very optimistic. But how do you get there? And you know, Ukraine has several oil and gas basins in the northeast, in the west, in the south, that all have underdeveloped, underexplored potential. And the key is to attract companies like ours, as well as majors, to come and be willing to take the risk to do this. And the reforms of the recent past of liberalizing the gas marketplace, creating gas on gas, for example, competition, is really important to the economics of any oil and gas project. We're a capital-intensive industry, and in order to take that risk, the rewards for those that take the risk need to be there. The associated permitting, the time it takes to get a license, and the time it takes to get permits to do operations are all part of the equation. But I think directionally, with the kind of potential that the country holds, we see a bright future for investing in different sectors of the upstream arena in Ukraine. There are existing fields that have been undernourished from a technological standpoint and from a capital standpoint. There are underdeveloped discoveries that have been made in the country that have not been followed up on in each of the major basins in the country. There are areas for exploration that exist that have not received proper exploration initiatives. And lastly, you know, I should mention all of this is focused on conventional oil and gas, conventional reservoirs, meaning that we're not talking about exploiting shale gas or shale liquids. If you add that to the equation, then you see a much larger picture for exploitation. And I like to draw the analogy to here, you know, in the United States, where more than a few decades ago, it was, you know, unfathomable to think that this country would be the leading producer of hydrocarbons in the world and become a net exporter. Even a decade ago, we were married to the idea of peak oil. You know, oh my God, we're going to run out of oil and gas. And what happened? Technological revolution occurred in the industry. Economic incentives were put in place in the form of reasonable royalties, reasonable taxation levels. And all of this together stimulated a renaissance, at least in my home state of Texas, in basins like the Permian Basin that were thought to be tapped out. And yet today we're making some of the largest discoveries the country's ever made in these basins for the reasons that I just described. And when you take that template, put it back on top of Ukraine, for explorers like us, we see that potential as very, very attractive. And I may stop there so I don't go on and on, Bud.
Let me ask quickly, though, for a snapshot of the geographic area that you're interested in, or where your activity may be focused. It's my understanding it's not one of the major basins.
No, I mean, we're working in probably an example of areas that, you know, as I've described in my previous comments, as having been underexplored and underdeveloped. Our focus is in southwestern Ukraine, in the Odessa Oblast, that contains a basin called the Dobruzha Basin that transcends southern Moldova and southwestern Ukraine. We're also focused on the northern rim of the Black Sea, on the shelf in shallow water in offshore Ukraine. And all of these areas have been recipients of historical drilling, historical geophysics, but not to the level that we believe will lead to uncovering oil and gas potential that we believe is there.
Okay, great. Dick, let me bring you into this. What do you think about the future of Ukraine's hydrocarbon sector and kind of how that meshes into the larger geopolitical picture that would include Russia, transit of Russian gas through Ukraine, the arbitration case that Ukraine won to establish a fairer market price for gas that Russia would sell to Ukraine, and how Ukraine should move ahead in its own kind of energy security sphere and how that affects the greater European picture.
Okay, well, thank you, Bud, and I'd also like to welcome everybody here. We have a great group here this afternoon, and the numbers that are here indicate how important you all think these issues are. I sort of look at it as the glass being half full, not to be a diplomat or whatever. I think what Ukraine has done in the past few years has been quite remarkable. When I came back into the government in 2009, made several trips to Ukraine over the following few years, if somebody had told me that Ukraine would reduce its consumption to some, whatever, 33 BCM or whatever, that it would not be buying Russian gas, and that 11 or so BCM would be being imported by reverse flow from Europe, that 21, 22 BCM, whatever, let alone 70, would be being produced domestically, I would say the person was on hallucinogens. I would absolutely have seen no way that could happen. Yet it has, and I think it's part of an integration into the European energy market. There's still a lot work to be done on electricity. There's been progress on the domestic front on reforms, still more to be done there. Royalties and taxes are probably too high still for investors, even though it's come down. There are a lot of things that still have to be worked through. But overall, I think Ukraine has done pretty well over the last couple of years from all of those standpoints. Having said that, I think we are in a serious state of uncertainty when it comes to where Ukraine's energy market is going to go. There's a tremendous amount, I think, of political uncertainty. Obviously, we don't need to talk more about Crimea and eastern Ukraine and problems with Russia and so forth. I think that does create a huge amount of political uncertainty. I think from the standpoint of foreign direct investment, it makes it difficult. The political risk probably makes financing pretty difficult. I'm not sure how many banks would be interested in funding projects in Ukraine. So those are issues that I think have to be addressed. So I think we have to take solace in the fact that Ukraine has done so well, and hopefully it will continue. But filling that gap between 20 BCM and 70 BCM and getting the investment to do that, I think is going to be a little hard. My grandmother was from Odessa, and she would say, from her mouth to God's ears. I think I'd have to say the same to Steve, when talking about your optimism in filling that gap from your mouth to God's ears, and hopefully he's listening closely. so so I think that there really are still some serious issues that have to be addressed. Just talking briefly about Nord Stream 2 and about sanctions. I don't know. I mean, I think we're in sort of an interesting situation with respect to Nord Stream 2. I think the downside of Nord Stream 2, there are several downsides to Nord Stream 2 from a Ukrainian standpoint. One, losing the transit fees potentially, which could be as much as $2 billion a year. I think there are some serious political downsides. I mean, why should Gazprom and Russia be rewarded after what after what their behavior has been done, what they've done in Crimea and eastern Ukraine? So I think there are certainly political downsides to it, and an increased reliance on Russian gas by Europe can't be helpful ultimately to the development of potentially the development of exports of Ukrainian gas. So there are still many issues. I think it's somewhat more likely that Nord Stream 2 will happen than I might have thought a couple of years ago. One of the interesting questions, there are still several interesting questions. What's going to be the that's the case, what's going to be the negotiated agreement between the Commission and Gazprom? And will Gazprom, for example, as part of a competition settlement, how closely monitored will they be as to following the third energy package? What about the promises that Gazprom has been made that there still can be transit through Ukraine? Will that really happen? How much will the Commission insist on that? And Germany, for that matter, insist on that, so that if done the right way, I mean, that can be somewhat helpful. I think it's still important for Ukraine, whatever happens with Nord Stream 2, to continue to do the things that it's doing. And I don't think anybody should take the position, well, if Nord Stream 2 happens, then forget about Ukraine and energy. I mean, I think it's not a zero-sum game. I just don't think that's the case. And Ukraine can do the things that you've been talking about, and that we've been talking about. Just briefly, I'll make two other brief points on increased U.S. sanctions. It'll be interesting to see what sanctions legislation does finally come out of Congress. If the President-Senate legislation is enacted, it would give the President the power to sanction pipelines. That could have some unintended consequences in some areas of the world, like the Southern Gas Corridor, where Lukoil is a partner. But it also would have an obvious effect on Nord Stream and the ability to finance Nord Stream. Now, at this point, even if the President had that discretion, I would say it's highly unlikely that he would exercise that. But you never know. I think if nothing else, we can say we have an unpredictable president. And who knows if the relationships all of a sudden went very different between the White House and Russia, what might he do in those circumstances? If nothing else, we had some discussion about it earlier today, it does increase, it's a question how much, but it does increase financial risk to the project. Maybe that would have an effect. I don't know. We'll see. As far as the arbitration case, it's still very much uncertain as to what the final decision is going to be as to damages, what effect that might have, and coming up to some kind of compromise with respect to Ukrainian transit. I don't know. The other question that comes up, and I'll stop. Maybe I'm going too long. I'm sorry. One quick point on LNG exports. I think U.S. LNG exports are very important to Europe. I think they will happen. I don't think it'll help Ukraine. All that they will do will help, and this is a good thing, I think, help keep prices down, whatever the gas supply is in Europe, whether from Ukraine, from Russia, from Qatar, from Algeria, from the United States. But it could make more difficult the investment risk as far as new projects in Ukraine if pricing is continues to be very low.
Great. Well, I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions when we open it up in a few minutes. Olga, I see you're still with us. I'd like to bring you back into the discussion and welcome any comments that you have on what you've heard from the other panelists. Also get into some additional areas, if you would, one being the use of coal as the third hydrocarbon, as opposed to natural gas, what you see as a kind of a preferred policy or balance between those two. What your view might be of the impact of Crimea and Russia on Ukraine's energy policies and development, including the impact of cyber attacks, and as well your thoughts on the support that you get and would like to get from the European Union and the United States. So please.
Let me just react a few.
Choose what you like.
Yes, Ambassador Morningstar Congress made excellent presentation of opportunities and challenges in Ukraine. So let me start with my heart, which is Nord Stream 2. I've been recently writing in many and using every international occasion to raise this issue up. Everybody is talking about it as business as usual. Ambassador, I totally agree with you that the risk of the project being in place right now is higher than, let's say, 3 years ago. But the situation is also different. I think one particular risk of security in Ukraine is underestimated. I do care about $2 billion on annual basis coming to my budget, because then it means this money goes to education and army for that matter. But even more so, I see greater risk of Russia behaving even more aggressively towards Ukraine, A, than B, when they have direct access via Nord Stream 2, and they have ability to negotiate and get discounts to those who behave well in European Commission. Then that's a completely different risk. Then we see more politicians being hired, former politicians from Europe being hired on Gazprom board. Then we see more discounts going on a non-competitive, non-transparent way, and then we see Europe being divided. And I don't want to waste my time and your time here, advocated, because I know U.S. politicians and diplomats are usually supporting us. But I do think what we all could do is that we should call EU colleagues to speak out publicly. If they are in favor, let them bear responsibility in future, because I think this project will be ruinous for Europe. But they prefer, whenever I go to Germany, they say, well, Olga, you understand, nobody wants to speak up on this. Everybody prefers to keep private positions. And here, the only strong partner for us so far is US. Your diplomats, your administration, regardless of who is your president, so far, at least they make an attempt to make a US position clear. So with EU, I totally agree that this is part of the challenge, how well we integrate, because we don't buy from Russia because we were able to buy from our European partners, and this is crucial and key to our future reforms. And I see some slowdown, but I have hopes that it's just, different temperature of, kind of understanding of how much reforms are important for us. Right now in Ukraine, it's different than it was in 2015. Then I agree with Mr. Nikandras that we have a lot of reserves. I think my job as a legislator is to make sure whomever comes to Ukraine and tries to do business in Ukraine in this area, they have variety of choices. They want licenses, they get licenses. If they want PSA, they get PSA. What I do not want to see, I do not want to see companies coming to Ukraine and trying to do some shady deals, be it via PSA or be it via other types of activities. So this is kind of to say we are very open and we are eager to hear your concerns, but everybody has to play equal rules. On Crimea and Russia, I don't want to sound undiplomatic, but I don't know any other word in English but to say that Russia is stealing our gas from Black Sea. This is reality. Chernomornaftogaz had those licenses. Chernomornaftogaz had wonderful equipment which was paid by huge amounts from our state budget. Now it's not ours, not only Crimea, but the gas and the reserves there remain untapped. In fact, whenever I travel abroad, I kind of try to engage serious partners into talks whether we should try to put a consortium of producers trying to do more business in Black Sea. And I strongly welcome Proterra's interest in that area. Russia will do anything that we stop buying from Europe. And for that, it is important for us to kind of increase our own production as fast as we can and increase our integration into Europe. With or without Nord Stream 2, we need to make sure that Ukrainian transmission system is upgraded. And here again, I don't believe we can do it at this particular political and geopolitical moment on our own, unless we bring Italian, German, US, Norwegian, or anybody from other more powerful countries and more experienced countries, unless we bring some operators to operate Ukrainian transmission system together, there are many different risks. So this is how I kind of see the complexity of our situation. The coal issue, I see some familiar faces in your room. You are more better position to comment on coal as a challenge, but let me tell you, very often people ask me, can you actually replace with gas all the needs for coal in your country? Potentially, yes, when we reach those 70 BCM. But at this point, economics doesn't make sense. I am not so much convinced about LNG as well. So far, I didn't see realistic numbers showing that LNG coming from US would be very attractive to Ukraine, but I'm very open to this idea. And I would disagree with Ambassador, on this little bit. Whomever you sell your gas, your LNG gas in Europe, you are helping us. Sell as much as you can, and that means to us that Russia sells less. That's a very straightforward point. So here we are in strong support of US expansion of your energy sources being sold in Europe. I think that's it.
Okay. Very good. Dick or Steve, do you have any comments? I think we have a lot of good points on the table here, and let's get some questions from the audience. Please, we have a microphone coming from the back.
Thank you. I'm Vitaly Tarasuk. I'm from the Embassy of Ukraine here in Washington, D.C., head of economic office. I just, you couldn't wish for a better panel today to describe the energy situation in Ukraine. And Olga and Ambassador and Steve Nikandras, and it's, I wouldn't go into, detail that's already been said, but I just wanted to to say that just recently we had the visit of President of Ukraine Poroshenko to the Washington here to the United States, and that cooperation is in energy sector is very high on a bilateral agenda right now. And cooperation in energy was very actively discussed during the meeting with Secretary Perry and with Secretary Ross. And you all, I think, saw the remarks of both Presidents, Trump and Poroshenko, about future cooperation in coal, in nuclear sector, in upstream. So it's really on the rise. And just to once again to show the dynamic of this cooperation, it wouldn't be too big a secret, I think, to say that in a couple of months, maybe less, we expect the visit of Secretary of Energy Rick Perry to visit Ukraine, and we actively work on components and to be this visit and this cooperation a success. So just small remarks on that. Thank you.
So no question? Next, please, right up here in front, and please identify yourself.
Hi, Lisa Friedman from the New York Times. I wanted to circle back to the coal issue that President Trump mentioned. He indicated in his speech that Treasury and State were going to address barriers to the financing of highly efficient coal plants overseas, and then specifically mentioned, he said, the millions and millions of metric tons that Ukraine tells us we need. Huh. Should I repeat all of that?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Specifically, my question is on coal. Okay. President Trump has said in his speech that the administration will address the barriers of financing for coal overseas, mentioning the Ukraine's need for coal. Can one of you talk about what it is that might change? What do you need to see? What would you like to see at State or Treasury to enable the ability to deliver more coal to countries like Ukraine?
This may be better for the next panel that's coming, but my business is the upstream oil and gas sector, fossil fuels, so I'll let the coal experts answer that question.
Olga, did you hear the question?
Change in terms of funding such deals, but I can tell you that the overall perception here that we welcome the idea of coal coming from U.S. Of course, the reality will depend on economical side of it, but we also value the partnership, kind of geopolitics of this partnership. So the idea is well perceived. We are waiting for more details, which we then include into our consideration in terms of tariff for the consumers.
Let me maybe just the point I would make is that
the quicker that countries like Ukraine, other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, whether it be Poland or Romania, other countries that are in a lot of ways very dependent on coal, the quicker they can move away from that and to lower carbon types of fuel, including gas, the better. I would say that the most important thing that this administration could do to help do that, as well as to ultimately give some help to the coal industry, is to double down on clean coal technology and to do everything possible to do the research to develop that technology, because that could be a real game changer.
I mean, I think David's probably best placed to answer that, but the coal, as a member of the energy sector here in the United States, the coal industry is just another example of what we were talking about earlier, of the huge reserves that exist here and our ability to provide that huge reserve economically to other end users around the world in a clean way.
Good. We have Any more questions, please? Bob, yes. And identify yourself.
Bob Eichhorn from the Atlantic Council. The President's visit to Poland also highlighted the issues with regards to security in the region. And obviously there's been an important historic relationship between Poland and Ukraine. And discussions, of course, about a north-south gas corridor that would provide another avenue for gas to Poland if such a corridor could be developed. I wondered if, Olga, you had any thoughts on that relationship and your discussions with the Poles about how to increase the security of both of your countries.
Applying to European Commission and objecting some of the developments. But Poland is also helping us to diversify right now our own situation with expanding capacity of the reverse flow going through Poland. So I cannot help but to say Poland is our friend right now. We have common interests. We are both and Baltic countries. We see this security risk, which we try to advocate vis-a-vis our German and French and some of the northern countries, colleagues. So I just don't know what to add to what you already know. There are no new developments, to my understanding, but we do expect European Commission to make finally the decision to which extent they will have mandate to discuss with Nord Stream.
Good. We have another question up front here on the front row.
Hello, it's Jock Mendoza-Wilson from System Capital Management Group in Kiev. Just a small point on coal production. In fact, our energy business, DTEC, will talk about coal later, but I'm going to talk about Metinvest, our metals business. It actually owns a large coal producer here in the United States called United Coal, and it produces over 1 million tons of metallurgical coal each year. In fact, most of that output is now exported from the United States to Ukraine. So we already have a very strong trade flow in very effective and efficiently produced US coal into Ukraine. That may or may not be repeated later with anthracite, but there'll be, I think that's a key point for discussion in the next panel. So it's not a question, more a short statement.
Well, thank you. More.
You are making America great.
Again.
That's again, but let me clarify for our audience. The key challenge, of course, in Ukraine is not with this type of coal, but with the anthracite coal. And this is an open question for us, whether we can have substantial supply of American coal coming to us at affordable price, so we can diversify our current supply.
Good. Question over here.
My name is Ted Contact. I'm an independent researcher. I have two quick questions. One, we're talking a lot about Nord Stream. Very clearly, for the last several years, Gazprom and other Russian leaders have indicated that the sole purpose of Nord Stream is to bypass Ukraine as a gas transit corridor. There's currently over 80 BCM excess capacity in gas transit to Europe, so even a doubling of Nord Stream is not economically justified. But yet, in order to completely bypass Ukraine, they also need to bypass the Trans-Balkan pipeline, the third pipeline going through Ukraine. And I've not heard anything about Turkish Stream and the danger that Turkish Stream poses to completely isolating Ukraine as a gas transit corridor for Russian gas to Europe. The final question is actually a comment. I keep hearing these wonderful statements that Ukraine is not purchasing Russian gas. It is purchasing Russian gas. The reverse flows are not Norwegian gas. They're not Dutch gas. They're Russian gas. It's just simply bought through a middleman or actually an additional person. So while it may make good copy to say that Ukraine hasn't purchased Russian gas, it is purchasing Russian gas. All the reverse flows are Russian gas. Is that not correct?
Go ahead, Olga, please.
Whenever I speak on this topic, I always say that we are not buying gas from Russia. Yes, you are correct. We are buying some kind of gas from our European partners. But even this one is extremely important in a situation when a country like mine is having a war with a country like Russia. So for us, it's a huge accomplishment. And this means that we do not depend on somebody who is unpredictable, even if you pay him. So for us, it's a huge accomplishment, and we will continue to speak about 500 days of not buying gas from Russia.
I think that Olga's point is actually very well taken.
As long as Europe continues to enforce its rules against destination clauses, so that once, in fact, that gas crosses into Europe, I think you're right, Olga, it's not Russian gas, it's a molecule of gas, and countries and companies are free to send it anywhere they want, including by reverse flow back to Russia, back to Ukraine. So that it's an important point, I think, what you just raised, but I think that there is an answer, at least some answer to that. Turkish Stream it raises some interesting questions, and I think you're right to raise it. We haven't heard that much about it. For a while, it sort of died on the vine when the relationship between Russia and Turkey was bad. That's changed, so it's back front and center. There are several points, though, before Turkish Stream is an effective conduit into Europe. First, the initial pipeline will only transport gas that already was going to Turkey presently through the Trans-Balkan pipeline. So it's not additional gas. If, in fact, through Turkish Stream, Gazprom tried to export to Europe, there are several obstacles that they'd still have to overcome. One is that the gas right now would only go to the Turkish-Greek border. That would be the present plan. Then how is it going to get into Europe? There's the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. The present stage of that pipeline that's being constructed now is full. And the gas is already spoken for by contract. So it would take an expansion, basically, I think ultimately, of the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, an agreement with all of those partners, with all of those countries in Europe, in order to export into Europe. There still would be considerable legal issues under the third energy package, depending how they did it. I guess the bottom line is it's a long way from here to there. It's something that's important and that we have to keep, I think, on the front burner of concern, but it's still quite a ways to go.
I want to add to what Olga and Dick said, and I think what's important in your question about is this Russian molecules is the reality is that the system is evolving, and it's created a flexibility now that I think will lead to something we haven't talked about yet, and that is Ukraine's ability to act as an energy hub for Europe with this massive resource potential that it has, massive existing transportation system that again, coming from where I come from, I kind of think of the Henry Hub in Louisiana in the United States. And then you add on top of that 30 BCM or so of storage for gas, the largest in Europe. And you have all the makings here of a gas hub for both trading and supply that can wheel gas into Ukraine, out of Ukraine, to bordering countries. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years with reverse flow is the start of something that can't be reversed, no pun intended, that this system is happening. And the best thing Ukraine can do to fight off more Nord Streams or more Turkish streams is to do the things we talked about at the start of this discussion, liberalize its own domestic markets to attract investment to develop its massive resources, and take control of its own destiny the way the United States has. We're no longer slaves to Middle Eastern oil, and there's no reason Ukraine needs to be slaves to Russian energy, because it has the potential to do the things it needs to do in upstream as well as the midstream and trading sectors. And what's happened in just a short period of time, in geologic time, is really quite something. And if this progress can continue with the government, there is a bright future that awaits within reach, within the next 5 to 10 years, I think.
Once again, I'm hearing from up there from my grandmother from Odessa.
But this vision, I think, is what's transformed this country from peak oil to exporting.
Just to complete the answer, I'm going to let the analysts in me come out for a minute. Nord Stream 2 is going to be 55 BCM in capacity. The two strings of Turk Stream together will be 31.5 BCM. So if you add those together on paper, they're close to being what Ukraine has transited. Although importantly, those new pipelines, if they are built, will not be completed by 2019. So there will have to be negotiations on a new transit agreement. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Claire Kaiser from McClarty Associates. We talked a lot at the outset about the really significant reforms that Ukraine has undertaken in the gas sector. And I was wondering if the panel could give us an update on where the state of reform is in the oil sector, and in particular, where that sort of fits on the, priority agenda for the next couple of years.
Olga, did you hear the question?
Slightly different nature. In terms of oil production, we have kind of one company which is half private, half state-owned, Ukernafta. They're in a very bad financial shape. But they are the only company which has realistically potential to develop more oil resources. There is a lack of trust between the state and the company. The management, the past, the debt they have, the whole problem is not around regulations or laws around this business, but rather the legacy of the past of the particular company. We agreed just today with the committee that we will have a special hearing on situation with Ukernafta. But in terms of their business, I expect the board of Naftogaz, because Ukernafta is part of Naftogaz right now in their current model, and they govern what is being produced by the Ukernafta and presented to our government as way for reforms. I am expecting their decision of how do they see the future of this company. Realistically, it should be either some kind of financial operation bringing more financial health to this company, or their licenses should be transferred to more kind of productive extractor of oil. The problem is that there are not a lot of companies which know how to work in oil business in Ukraine, which is different for gas. All I'm trying to say is that they need less of help of RADA because the laws are in place. Maybe they need some corrections in terms of fiscal conditions, but they do more attention from our government in terms of immediate financial resolution for their debt and financial future. The situation is complex, let me tell you. The situation is very complex. I'm trying to find a way how to give you promising future. But realistically, when you look at our needs, gas is of more importance. This is priority for obvious reasons. And this is realistic to make a breakthrough. With oil, I don't think we have enough of reserves and resources which will allow Ukraine to be independent fully in foreseeable future.
Either of you have anything? Any more questions? If not, we do need a little transition to the next panel. So I want to thank you all again, and stay tuned for our next show. Thank you, Olga.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be getting ready to start the second panel soon. If you could please take your seats.
And I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. I deal with economic policy in Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and written a couple of books about the Ukrainian economy, which I think is one of the more exciting things that we have had in recent years. And I'm happy to introduce to you a very prominent panel here with four different speakers. Closest to my left, I have Dr. Chris Singh, who is president, founder, and CEO of Holtec International, which is a company doing nuclear energy, including in Ukraine. Next, we have Michelle Small, who's the representative and director of the Office of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development here in Washington, D.C. And next, we have Mr. David Muller, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Clean Coal and Carbon Management as the U.S. Department of Energy, who has been deeply involved in Ukraine as well. And finally, but not least, we have Vitaly Butenko, who is Commercial Director of DTEC, which is the big power generating company in Ukraine beside the nuclear power. And he has been working previously in various international companies. And I would like to start, actually, yes, I should say that this panel is supposed to be about electricity, coal, and nuclear, but of course you're welcome to bring in the general energy issues in Ukraine as well, that we undoubtedly will deal with. And the idea is to get into more of what has happened in these specific areas. And one of the biggest events we have seen in the last year has been a massive blockade which stopped the railway wagons coming from the occupied territories of Ukraine, where DTEC produced coal in its coal mines. So these could no longer be transported because of its popular action against this transportation that the government picked up in March and blocked all together. And this coal was transported to DTEC's power stations in free Ukraine. And as you can hear, this was a rather confusing story. So Vitaly, Can you explain to us what was it that actually happened? How much did it cost? And to what extent have you managed to resolve this problem? And how do you see the future?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anders. For those who are not familiar, DTEK is the largest private diversified energy company in Ukraine. Our main business is coal and thermal power generation, but we also present in gas production and renewables. In order to understand the impact and significance of the blockade that took place earlier this year, I'll take a step back and quickly give you an overview of the structure of the power generation sector in Ukraine. That would help you understand the significance. The power generation sector in Ukraine consists of about 55% nuclear, which is state-owned. Then you have hydro, which is about 10% of the total volume, and about 35% of the power being generated in Ukraine is generated by the thermal power plants. There is about 5% of the renewables, but they don't have much of an impact. Now, the thermal power plants are primarily operating on the coal. Their design originally, back at the time of the Soviet Union, was made on the basis of using the coal being mined on the territory of Ukraine. Two types of coal, to be specific. One is a steam coal, and the other is an anthracite coal. There are seven power units which are using steam coal, and there are 7 power units using anthracite coal. In terms of the structure of the production, about 65% of the power typically is being produced, thermal power being produced by the steam coal-based thermal power plants, and about 35% with the anthracite. Now we're getting to the interesting part. Now, as far as the location of the mines, it so happened that all the mines that produced anthracite coal are located on the uncontrolled territory, basically the territory which was part of this Russian hostilities, and is no longer under direct control of the Ukrainian government. Now, the steam coal mines, they are operating on the controlled territories, and as such, there is no problems with accessing those mines. Now, when the hostilities took place, we've been experiencing substantial difficulties of trying to export coal, which is produced, anthracite coal, on those territories. Now, we own three large anthracite mining companies, Ravinki, Sverdlov, and Komsomolets-Donbass. The names don't mean much, but they were covering all our needs, plus on top of that, we were also supplying anthracite coal to the state-run thermal power plants such as Center Energo. Now, what happens is in March, and the blockade on the Ukrainian side of all the shipments of coal, or goods for that matter, from the uncontrolled territory was stopped. For political reasons, for a number of reasons, but the blockade has been initiated on the Ukrainian side in this particular instance. Now, and it triggered the chain of events, such as the people who are currently controlling the territory in the east of Ukraine, they decided to seize all the mines, which were prior to the blockade, were under our direct control. Now, the mines, while they were located on the uncontrolled territories, we still were managing and controlling and paying salaries to the people working there. We didn't pay any taxes to the local uncontrolled governments, but otherwise, all the investment and everything, that was our responsibility. That was the part of the game plan to keep the energy system in balance. So. Shortly after the blockade was introduced, we lost the control of all those mines, and at this point of time, not only we're not able to import or to bring any coal from those territories, but we also no longer exercise any control of what's happening there. It was a classic kind of pirate type seize of assets, if you like. Now, that development put the entire power sector in quite a precarious position, because in terms of the volumes, if normally the Ukrainian power sector would consume about 15 million ton per year for the steam coal, and about 9 million ton of anthracite coal would be necessary in order to provide enough fuel for the anthracite power plants. Now, all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a situation where no anthracite coal is coming in. As a part of the emergency plan, and it was done jointly with our participation in the ministry, the reduction of the dependence on anthracite coal has to be ensured, and it was achieved. Partial reduction was achieved through increase of the nuclear power generation, through increasing the load factor for the steam coal thermal power plants. Basically, more power will be produced by the steam coal type of units. And all that reduced the dependence by about 3 million. But still, when we look at the balance of things, so on an annual basis, you still need to bring 6 million ton of anthracite coal in order to ensure there is enough power for the country. And that puts us in front of the very limited number of choices. Where would you get that coal? It has to be import. Clearly, there is always the Russian option, but as we are well aware of the Russian option, how it played out back in 2014, when all the coal shipments from the territory of conflict was seized, we contracted a number of volumes from the Russian coal miners, only to find ourselves in a situation when the Kremlin introduced the blockade on its side, and no Russian coal could reach Ukraine. Then you go to the geographically further located options, such as South Africa, Australian coal, and of course we come to potentially to U.S. coal, anthracite coal. Now, the difficulty with the anthracite coal is not because there is not enough of it in the world, because it has to correspond to the very strict technical qualities in order to be able to use for the energy purposes, because anthracite is used widely in the metallurgy in other areas, but it doesn't mean it could easily be transferred to the thermal. So there is not that much coal that fit the profile for the Ukrainian units. Even South Africa, which is a huge exporter of anthracite coal, they probably have about maybe a million to 1.5 million per year of the anthracite that could meet our needs. So it's still not sufficient. You can go to Australia. There are some quantities, but not enough. So you kind of need to go and gather it. The anthracite, which is being mined in U.S., wasn't originally aimed for the energy sector. It was more for metallurgically. So, but there are some quantities which I believe could be used for the thermal power plants. The other side of this problem is, of course, cost. Because there is one thing when you're mining and you have a much shorter lag for the transportation. The other things when you have to bring it from far away. And what aggravates the situation for the Ukrainian buyers, such as us and other anthracite power plants, is that the terms of financing, because you need to take a position. You need to take a position with the prepayments. If you want to fix the price, it has to be a longer-term contract. But then you run into the roadblock as a tariff, which is being regulated and set up by the domestic thermal power plants. And as it stands today, the tariff doesn't cover the cost of the anthracite, which you can source, which you need to source from overseas. It does, even despite of the fact that it is linked to the API2 formula, but the spot market is higher. So you are also.
But Vitaly, we shouldn't go in too much into the details. But as I understand it, the blockade is there to hold. You don't expect that you will get back control over the anthracite mines in occupied territory, and this is a big cost. The IMF has reduced GDP growth for Ukraine by about 1% because of this blockade, and you don't see any easy solutions, that this will be a dragging problem that will take some time.
No, for all intents and purposes, we believe that the access to the anthracite mines located in the territory in any foreseeable future will be closed. But and to add to that, in order for those mines to be operational, you need to continue to invest. And to the best of my knowledge, people on that territory who seize those assets, they don't have technical expertise or money needed to invest, nor do they have the market. So within the matter of the next 3 to 6 months, some of those mines will probably cease to be operational, period. And even if they were returned, the chances of us taking over that would be incommensurate with the economic formula, with the economic results of operating those mines.
Yeah. Let me move on a bit to David Muller. You are principal, you're Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Energy with special responsibility for clean coal. Previously, you have been working as a Senior Vice President at Duke Energy, and you have also worked on nuclear energy. So what is the U.S. Point of view here? What would the U.S. like to see in the coal and nuclear energy areas in Ukraine?
Well, first, let me clarify my affiliation. So I'm a former DOE governmental official. I was an Obama appointee, so as of January 15th, I'm no longer in the government. But I continue to stay active in this arena because I feel like we did a body of work that deserves to move forward, and I'm engaged in a number of different entities to try to continue that engagement. So then to answer your specific question, you know, what do we really see? So I was, the reason I went to Ukraine, and I think I've been there 4 times over a 2-year period, was actually with the International Affairs Group at Department of Energy, and it was to leverage more of my broader industry background to look at ways that we might be able to really collaborate with Ukraine on strengthening the entire energy system. So we were really looking for ways that might be possible in ways that Ukraine would desire and want to engage. And a couple, I think, of the really pertinent things that we saw, in particular, last December, I took 2 teams of people to Ukraine, and we spent 12 or 13 days, and we toured literally every power plant not in the uncontrolled area. And we actually also toured Slavyanska, which I think is right on the borderline of controlled and uncontrolled. At least we had to pass through military checkpoints to get there. But one of the things that we began to think about, we came away with 3 big thoughts. One was we have a series of recommendations that we believe could be relatively quickly and at very low cost taken to improve operational efficiencies and reduce emissions in both thermal power plants and CHP operations. And so we wanted to put those in the hands of Ukrainian companies and entities who might wish to implement them. The second thing that we saw was the potential, and a lot more work would need to be done, but the potential to source U.S. Anthracite and especially bituminous coal. Many of the plants that we visited represented to us that with some modification they could burn bituminous coal, the ones that burn anthracite now, that might well be advantageous as a means of dealing with the difficulty of anthracite supply in Ukraine. And that in some ways could really be a kind of a win-win for our 2 countries, because in this country, as natural gas prices have come down and coal production has accordingly fallen off, there are many communities in the U.S., especially in Appalachia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Virginia, that were former coal mining centric, where jobs are now scarce and where any economic development potential would be very welcome. So that was a thought. Is there more to explore in terms of potential export of anthracite and even bituminous coal to Ukraine? And the third was really the idea that we might be able to collaborate on longer-term capital formation for the the energy industry in Ukraine. Many of the assets that we toured when I was there over the last couple of years are kind of well beyond design life at this period. Many of the power plants were built in the 1950s and 60s. And the operators of those plants, and DTEC stands out actually, the operators are very committed to those assets. They use the assets, they use the resources at hand to do the things that need to be done to continue operation in the best way possible. But what's not clear is where the continuing longer term investment comes from. So those were the three big takeaways, and maybe I'll leave it there and we can have further discussion.
Yeah, let's move on. So I bring all of you into the discussion and I'll come back with further questions later on. Dr. Singh, you have developed a big company, Holtec International, in nuclear energy, and Ukraine is one of your big engagements. What do you see that you would like to do in Ukraine, and how do you find it?
Oh, that's a large question.
Starting from the top.
We do have a significant presence in Ukraine. We have been in Ukraine since 2005, 2003, and we have gone through the trials and tribulations of the country over these years. We actually signed a contract with Energoatom, the national nuclear company, to provide them a central storage facility to store all the used nuclear fuel from the plants. Right now, Ukraine is shipping them to Russia because they have no other place to ship them. And it costs about $200 million a year to the Ukrainian economy, treasury. The facility that we are now building will cost approximately $35 million a year. So the country will save about $165 million a year in net savings, which is, as you can see, is not chump change. So it will help. It will help the country.
Interesting.
I'm personally very, very impressed with Ukraine's workforce. We employ a large number of people there, engineers, and they are excellent, well-trained engineers. And that gives me hope that the country, as it gets its act together, it will grow rapidly. I really believe this country will grow rapidly, and we want to be a part of it. Our solution for Ukraine, and people ask me in the country, of course, what should the country be doing? The coal plants have gotten old. They're inefficient. I mean, you can look at the numbers. The installed capacity in Ukraine, the thermal plants, is like 65% or 66%. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And the installed capacity for nuclear is about 26% of the total. And yet the power delivered by nuclear is about, this year up to May, I was told, is 57%. So nuclear is producing more than half the power with 1/4 of the installed capacity. And it is not subject to aggression from the insurgents and the Russians and so on. It's a solid, reliable source of power, and it produces no pollution. So the solution for the country really is to build more nuclear plants. And that's what I tell them. They need to not build the gigantic plants that the Soviets were building, or in the US they have been building, but to build small plants. They are geographically distributed, and therefore they are more difficult to sabotage and cause problems. They are also being made. They can be absolutely safe against any kind of an accident. Fukushima, Chernobyl. Think of the accidents. Any conceivable accident. You can make a small plant that is absolutely safe against them, and that's what we think is right for Ukraine. It needs to build a large number of them because it has signed on to the Paris Accord, which the country has committed to reducing carbon dioxide emissions by 60% by 2030. And that's not possible unless you move away from fossil fuels and produce more nuclear energy. Now, I don't know whether it can be done by 2030, but certainly I think Ukraine is a great candidate to get support from the COP21 countries, you know, the OECD countries to provide financial help so they can build these plants, and DITEC should get into nuclear.
60% reduction, that is from what year? Is it from 1990 or from the present that they would reduce from? Because if it's from 1990, it's quite easy because much of the polluting industry is gone.
You know, the news that I saw, I did not check so carefully, but I believe it's from now. From 1990, I stand corrected. Then that's better.
So then probably at least half of the saving, or if not more, has already been done.
Yeah. But you know, these small reactors, they cost to the tune of $800 million. They will. It is not a huge outlay. EBRD can pay for a bunch of them and no sweat. So that is a way to make the country's energy infrastructure stable. Also, I should say that as renewables come online, you have to have plants that follow the load. You know, they can't be base-loaded plants. So these small nuclear reactors can also follow the load. So for Ukraine, it's a perfect situation, but it will need, the country will need assistance from OECD countries that want to see pollution, carbon dioxide consumption go down. And that, of course, is above my pay grade. It'll have to be discussed in other forums.
Well, the thermal power industry in Ukraine is predominantly private. The nuclear power industry is completely state-owned. It's one big state company, Energoatom, that we are now seeing that the person who checked it from Parliament, Mykola Martynenko, is now under arrest, or is out on bail for having tapped money from Energoatom. What do you see as a future of the nuclear power industry? Will it be private companies? Will it be broken up? Or do you have any sense of that?
Well, yeah, what will happen is, you know, in the political world is hard to tell, but I think the right thing for the country to do is to privatize it with certain changes. Right now, and I don't know about who got arrested and so on, but I can tell you this, the whole structure of power generation for the nuclear industry in Ukraine is kind of perverse. If Energoatom were to produce energy more efficiently, then the national board that sets the tariff will reduce the money they'll get for it. So every time Energoatom improves its performance, the amount given to Energoatom per kilowatt produced goes down. So what's the incentive to improve? None. Right? That's just a basic stupidity that sometimes government live with for a long time before they realize, but that's a fact in Ukraine. There is no incentive to improve. I give credit to the people who run Energoatom and the people who operate the plant, that in spite of it all, they have been trying to reduce their cost. Ukraine's tariff, the money paid to Energoatom, is the lowest in Europe. It is the lowest. They get roughly 1/3 of what the French utility gets from the French government. It is doing extremely well, but in terms of performance, but they get no money because the rate is set by the state, and they get a cost plus, not enough even to maintain their investment intact. So the utility is poor. You know, the nuclear utility, Energoatom, is financially poor. Well, they can't go build new nuclear plants if they don't have any money. So the right thing to do would be to privatize Energoatom, and the state, the government agrees to pay nuclear plants the same price they will pay fossil plants. If they do that, if they just have parity, then money will pour in from overseas to invest in Ukraine's nuclear industry because it will make money. And you know how it works. If a company that has a concession from the government that we will buy power from you that you produce at the same rate, not a discriminatory rate, same rate that we will charge, we pay to the fossil industry, then there will be great incentive for people to invest. And that private company, Energoatom, would be a successful company. It will be building nuclear plants, and the supply of energy in the country, clean energy, will blossom. So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn that question to Vitaly, because you have had considerable problems with tariffs in 2015, while last year you were rather happy about your tariffs. And previously also you were complaining that you were discriminated against by the Energoatom, but Energoatom had much nicer conditions. So let us have here a suitable discussion about how the tariff situation is for nuclear and thermal powered industry.
I'll speak about the tariff, but maybe a few comments on on the very bright nuclear future for Ukraine that I just heard is one of the directions. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to paint the picture in such a simple terms as far as the nuclear concern, although I agree with your conclusions as far as the capacity and utilization, etc., etc. But we have to bear in mind, number one, that nuclear, despite all the benefits that it may bring, is still reliant on the imported fuel source, and the majority of this coming from Russia. So when we are talking about expanding the portfolio, perhaps first we need to maybe replace the Russian fueled capacity to non-Russian, which would probably what American. So there are some experiments with that. So it's not as simple and straightforward as that. Plus nuclear, it's your base load, and we've seen over the past few months the system operator were pushing to the maximum the production of the nuclear in order to save some anthracite. What happens that they were running at a very high utilization level, but with the limited reserve capacity. And where would the reserve capacity come from? Exactly from thermal. So if you get rid of thermal, the nuclear has to be double of what they're operating, because you still need to have a reserve, and you know the technical specification. As far as the tariff, and getting to the tariff situation, it continues to be quite volatile. You were right reminding us that there was a period when we were discriminated against at the thermal power plants against the tariffs. Nuclear has never been discriminated, but it's a state-run, and it's always, despite of the fact that the cost plus seems to be like unfair from the investment point of view, but they're feeling pretty comfortable with the kind of cash flow that they're seeing. Now, up until the blockade, things were more or less equal, because there was a new formula introduced for which was linked to the tariff setting, you know, the API 2 plus logistics. Now that whole thing kind of blew up in the air, because now you need to import anthracite, the costs are substantially higher, and we are not able to operate our business with that kind of expensive fuel source economically justifiably. But as to the situation with the going forward with the tariff, and I think you need to take into account that when the new law comes into effect, which is starting from the second half of 2019, nuclear will be in the same position as any other generator. They will be able to price their energy not on the regulated tariff, which is right now, and it's capped, you may argue, artificially low, sufficient to cover the cost, but that was primarily aimed to keep the overall the cost of the tariffs for power in Ukraine. So that's going to be a market game, and we're already beginning to model what it's going to impact. And the chances that nuclear will be keeping it artificially low is next to zero. Most likely, they will hit the market with their base load. They will probably command a much higher price. They will be more competitive than us, but they need us. And us, and when I'm referring to us, is the thermal power generation for the reserve capacity as well as for covering the peaks. And nuclear on a standalone basis is quite vulnerable, because to the extent that you can you can erode their base load, they would, because they cannot maneuver, they cannot just switch it on and off. So now, of course, if you have smaller nuclear solutions that you're referring to in the future, that would give them a little bit more flexibility. But as it stands right now, considering all other outstanding issues, this is not as straightforward transition as one would like to think.
Yeah, let me just comment here. It's interesting, you do believe that the electricity market will really come into force in the second half of 2019?
Absolutely.
Because the gas market has taken quite some time to come. Yeah, please, Dr. Singh.
Yeah, when that happens, actually, if there's parity, then I think Ukraine will have a robust nuclear construction program, because they'll have the money. I am not, you should know, I'm also a coal guy. I designed a lot of equipment. Oh, yes. So we don't have a vested interest in nuclear. I do have a vested interest in Ukraine. I want to make sure that the policies in the country are right. We have invested far too much emotion and energy to not help do the country the right thing. Ukraine, if they build small modular reactors, then they will have the ability to follow load. I also think that this should be privatized so people like Vitaly can build. There is no reason why it should be all built by the government. And I think that would also, you will have plenty of money coming in from overseas to build. It will create a whole new industry. It will spur manufacturing in the country. Energoatom wants to localize all manufacturing. So that's a perfect potion for success, economic success. So in that sense, I really believe that it will be a good thing for the country. The old nuclear plants will have to be retired also. They're coming up on life extension. They have done life extension of 6 units so far. They have to do others, but no matter what, by 2030, from 2030 to 2040, these plants will be retiring. And the planning to replace them also has to be made now. The energy situation in Ukraine 30 years from now, 20 years from now, will be substantially different from it is today. What the challenge the country has and the leaders in the country have is to devise a policy that is sustainable. You can't have all nuclear. You can't have a single source of power. You have to have diversity. You have to have diversity in supply. And I should inform you one item that may not be well known. U.S. supported Ukraine to develop an alternative supply of nuclear fuel. That program was supported by the U.S. government, and it's been a successful program. Westinghouse provided some assemblies, test assemblies, many years ago, and then they worked out fine. South Ukraine, they tested them. Then they put in another batch of 42 assemblies, which are currently being irradiated in the reactor, and they seem to perform extremely well. So Ukraine now, strictly speaking, has an alternative. They are no longer reliant on Russia. And certainly the SMRs that we sell, the small modular reactors, they will not use Russian origin fuel. That won't be.
Okay, I would like to bring in Michelle Small here also. Michelle represents EBRD, which is by far the biggest investor in Ukraine, and EBRD also plays a major role in fighting for good corporate governance, both in the private sector and in the state sector. I should say here, I just came back literally just before this session from Dubrovnik, where the IMF had a conference led by Christine Lagarde about the East European economies. And a broad consensus there was that the most important country in terms of economic reform now in the region is Ukraine, because Ukraine is at the same time the most transparent and open country, and it is, according to the measurements, as corrupt as Russia. So this is not a stable situation. It's a disequilibrium. And in such a situation, civil society is very important, and the international financial community is very important. I should say Alexander Danilyuk, the Minister of Finance, was there in spite of just having broken his leg in London, because he's out fighting for his country, even in such a situation. So Michelle, what do you think that the BBRD wants to be done, particularly in the energy sector, and what possibilities do you see for you?
Well, as you said, we are the largest investor in Ukraine, and about 35% of our portfolio is in the energy sector. There we look at supporting projects that focus on renewables, so that's a key priority for us. In the nuclear space, we only look at nuclear safety projects. And then finally, we are looking to support the latest legislation that has surrounded the electricity market and sector and the gas sector. So there, as you know, we have a large investment with a corporate governance program with Naftogaz. But that corporate governance program is not just specifically for Naftogaz, it's for all of the SOEs. So in energy, we're looking at projects also. The earlier panel talked about the vast storage facilities or possibilities for the Ukraine. And that's a part of the sector that we want to strongly support, because we want to exploit that going forward. So that's something we're looking at. We're also seeing small projects in the gas sector. We see possibilities in upstream for gas and opportunities. So going forward, I mean, not what we've done, but going forward, those are the sort of things we're looking to do in this year. But tied to all of that and underpinning all of that is our support for the reforms. So we're, putting aside that the project must be bankable and have no integrity issues, we see our leverage for projects, we use that to influence the reforms. We're not the IMF, even though while you were with Christine today, our MD for economics policy, Mattia, was with me at the IMF. We're talking together about closer cooperation in countries, and one of the ones is the Ukraine. So we're not as big as they are, so we target our policy dialogue, and we target them around the projects that we do. And the way we look at the energy, because we have so much that we have to do in the Ukraine, this is why we focus on these sort of pillars in the energy sector.
With regard to renewables, what possibilities do you see there? I'm thinking of what kind of renewables, and how do you try to invest in it?
Well, we look at all types, different types of renewables, and I think because it's one of our priorities, we would look broadly at it, and because one of the other key things that we want to do is to sort of help towards this target, because the bank also has the green economy target that all our projects should be 40% of our projects should be green by 2020. So that's why we focus a lot on that, and we look broadly at it. So we're not sort of looking at any specific parts of that.
If I may,
Please,
from
please.
DTEC perspective, renewables is from the strategic point of view is one of the primary directions that we're taking, building on our existing wind portfolio. But wind and solar is where we see the growth can potentially come from, and there is quite a potential in our estimates for both type of renewables, and this is, I think, where we will see a lot of action taking place, investments coming in, and a lot of players showing interest, and I'm sure that we will see very decent.
I think on that topic as well, we've seen a lot from this office where we are looking to attract sort of U.S. Canadian investment into countries, and like Ukraine, we've seen a lot of inquiries on solar. So that's that backs that up.
Yeah.
David, what was the Obama administration policy on this? We dare not say about the current administration as yet.
So the policy on what?
On renewables in Ukraine.
Very much positive, very supportive. In fact, when I was in Ukraine this last December, I toured Chernobyl, among other things, both because I was very interested in its current status, but also because it's been chosen as a solar site.
So yes.
So all for it.
Lots of wind in southern Ukraine and lots of wonderful sun also. So you're going for both of it.
It sounds like a tourist commercial. Come to us. We have sun and wind.
And solar panels on
and good
Chernobyl.
food, yes.
At that time, I think that we should try to open it up. I have more questions, but please. Yes.
Lisa Friedman again from the Times. I was wondering.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, Lisa Friedman again from the Times. I was wondering if one of you might be able to take a stab at what you think the president meant when he talked about the barriers of financing highly efficient overseas energy plants, and specifically mentioned Ukraine. What do you see as the big barriers holding the U.S. back from delivering more coal to the Ukraine? Is it guidelines that are at the Treasury Department restricting coal financing? Is it, would you want to see the U.S., ask the World Bank to loosen its restrictions on coal, which I know was a hard-fought battle? What is it that you think should happen, might happen, to change this dynamic?
I can take a first shot at that if you like. There has been a perspective, certainly when I was in the U.S. government, that was averse to making long-term investments in long-lived assets that were highly likely to be highly CO2 emitting and other pollutant emitting as well. So there was a great deal of focus on ensuring that the U.S. did not finance kind of the subcritical coal units, the coal units that are most highly emissive, both in terms of CO2 and other pollutants. That being said, we did work very hard on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And while this may be far in the future from a Ukrainian point of view, I do believe there's potential for carbon capture, utilization, and storage in Ukraine. As Steve, I want to make sure I get his last name right, Steve Nikandros on the earlier panel mentioned, the unconventional oil and gas reserves in Ukraine are probably about double the conventional reserves. And CO2 injection for CO2 for enhanced oil recovery could be actually, I believe, profitable in Ukraine. Now that once again requires significant study, but that would be a way to take coal technology, prolong its life, capture the CO2, use it for productive purposes and to the benefit of the Ukrainian economy in kind of a closed cycle. So I think that at least when I was in the government through January 15th, that was really the issue. The issue was, please let's not build a lot more subcritical coal units with no controls. Let's think about how to build that next generation, and oh, by the way, think about how to utilize the CO2 rather than just emitting it.
Vitaly, you
want
to add something?
I think key term here is clean coal. And I think the U.S. has an opportunity to take a lead, given the shifts in the sentiment with the new administration, to make coal great again.
Do you have a hat?
Because that issue in itself will bring back the whole, the fuel source, which historically been one of the fundamental for the economic growth across the countries. And not everyone has the capacity or opportunities or financial leverage to make a radical shift from the coal, from the not very clean sources to clean. It's going to take some time. But now, if there were a solution for the clean coal, then that's a paradigm shift. It's a totally different ball game. As far as the ongoing or potential supplies of coal from U.S. To Ukraine. First of all, we need to make sure that there is technically they are suitable for the Ukrainian energy sector, and we're talking about anthracite. Ukraine is capable to cover its needs for the steam coal. And the other aspect is going to be the terms of financing. Clearly, the Ukrainian power sector buyers, they're experiencing the liquidity squeeze and the issues with the tariffs, etc. So to go into the kind of longer-term coal supply contract, you need to have a financial support. But as far as the pricing is concerned, I believe that it should be driven by the market rather than the subsidies, because then we are not really solving the issue. We're trying to shift the burden from one shoulder to another. And I think the market pricing should be fundamental. However, the terms of financing, if that could be somehow aided with, that certainly would make it easier to entertain longer-term contracts. But bear in mind that as part of the initiative of reducing the reliance on the anthracite coal, we're also studying converting the anthracite units into the steam coal units. Centrenergo, which is a state-run company, that already done 2, and they're going to do another 2 by the end of the year. We've done 2 units, and we're going to do another 2 units next year. So it's a kind of the midterm solution. We're trying to reduce our dependence on the imported source. And as long as you control your own fuel, be it coal or gas, you feel much more secured, irrespective of what geopolitical pressure you may be put under.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Pete O'Brien, Country Manager, Ukraine for Eurocape New Energy. I'm wondering if you're not missing a chair up on the podium for renewables, because I think when I sit here and I look at, I think we saw that earlier on hydrocarbons, and then we see nuclear, we see coal, we see Vitaly representing electricity. I think we need to do a dynamic analysis when we're talking about the electricity sector in Ukraine, and we need to talk about supply and demand for a second. And when I look at demand, I see demand coming back quite strongly for electricity. I think anyone who knows the Ukrainian economy sees it picking up steam. It's been going on for a while, and I think it's going to hopefully continue to accelerate pretty quickly. I think there have been references all around to the age of the nuclear assets, and particularly to the thermal assets. And I think over the medium term, at some point, we're going to see the supply and demand curves cross. I think if we take a step back on nuclear, I'm not an expert like you all are on the panel, but if I understand it, we took 4 blocks offline from Chernobyl and only added on, K2R4, something like that, only added on 2 blocks. So there's been a net reduction of 2,000 megawatt on the nuclear side. And if you look at the capital intensity of electricity power generation, over the medium term, the question is, where's the capital going to come from? I don't think EBRD's made a wonderful contribution to the electricity sector, but I think it's beyond the capacity of the IFIs. I don't see the Ukrainian government as being able to fund that demand, and I think even the private capital coming into the market is not enough. I think it's going to be a combination of everybody. And I think renewables can play play a role in the solution to the power generation equation going forward. And if you look at international trends in Europe, in Asia, in North America, I think that's being borne out, and I think Ukraine is going to be a participant in that. And in fact, I think if you look at capital flows into the power generation sector in 2017 and 18 going forward, I think power generation, renewables are going to play a big role. And I think that there's a big boom in solar right now. I think you're going to see wind come back as well. So I wanted to talk about that. And the last comment I wanted to throw out, in terms of policy tools and instruments, I think the key missing ingredient for the renewable sector today is a bankable power purchase agreement. I know that that's been a big initiative of EBRD. That's been an initiative with IFC, Energy Community Secretariat is working on that as well. But I think if you're looking for low-hanging fruit, if you can introduce a power purchase agreement that's international standard into the Ukrainian market today, you can increase the access of Ukraine-based projects to the international capital markets. It's a win-win for everybody. So I just wanted to throw that out because I'm hoping the next time we have this panel, renewables will be able to take its place on the podium. Thank you.
I look up on Michelle as renewables.
Well, in terms of financing, I'm not going to go very deeply into the technical.
Please stop.
But I think that's one of the reasons why EBRD sees renewables and energy efficiency in the Ukraine energy sector as important. We understand the need to diversify. Obviously, we can only support projects that are there. So, we don't go around and do the projects ourselves. We finance the project when it becomes bankable. We support the infrastructure and the reforms around that. I don't have the details with me on what we're doing in that sector, but I know that we are working with the other IFIs closely, and if this is one of our priorities, it must be one that we're looking at, and I will check and come back.
Yeah, let me add to that. Renewables have to be a part of the mix. No country should or would put all their eggs in one basket. Of course, you have to have renewables, and it will develop, but I hope it develops in the right way. In the United States and some other countries, there was a huge subsidy given to renewables, and that killed several nuclear power plants because nuclear plants were not subsidized. Renewables were. Once the government intervenes in the marketplace and makes decisions for the economy, it always has bad side effects, always has bad side effects. So if the idea is you provide a power tariff that applies to all sources of energy, thankfully solar has come down in price, panels have come down in price, so it will compete. And let them compete for the share of the energy market. The utility should be privatized, I believe, the nuclear utility. And if it isn't, at least create a parallel private sector where companies from around the world can come, build the plant. It takes 3 years to build a small modular reactor plant, not 10 years like the old ones. You can start them. You can, if the economics works, money will come. The most abundant thing on this earth right now is not uranium or coal. It's money. There's so much money in Wall Street, no place to go. So yes, if you provide a viable condition, if Ukraine provides a viable condition for people to build power plants, people will come. Holtec will be there building because it makes financial sense. If they said, we will set the tariff, we the government will set the tariff, who's going to go invest in a country where you don't have an assured rate of return on your capital? So the real problem is with government policy. If they understand it, and thankfully, President Poroshenko has asked me to be on his National Economic Advisory Council, something like that. So I'll have an opportunity to say these things to the government. But, it's a simple economics. And absolutely the government has to be watching out to make sure that no industry gets crushed. Because, coal, we need coal. It can't be shut down tomorrow. But these plants are getting old, and eventually they will have to be decommissioned. And what we do after that is the question. And we should definitely support renewables, but not distort the marketplace.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of points. First of all, I agree with you 100%. Renewables absolutely must have a seat on this panel or any other panel. In Ukraine today, the way I personally look at renewables, it's like, you know, your most favorite youngest child. You know, the older children, they can, you know, get hit and they're going to be punished, but not the renewables. They're protected by the law, the feed-in tariff until 2030. Don't touch it. In fact, when I see the daily reports when there is wind blowing, I see my tariff dropping because the renewables are sucking in more money into themselves. Very happy for them. It's hard to, but to the point that it has to be a fair game. Right now, it's not clear with the new market in 2019 whether the new capacities of renewables, how they're going to be treated. But from the strategy, DTEC strategy point of view, we look at it as, and it directly touches on renewable, the 3D matrix. It's decentralization, decarbonization, and digitalization. And the distributed generation, which is going to be driven by the renewables, you know, the house installed like solar panel, etc. And decarbonization we clearly see as an interim, you know, cornerstone of the Ukrainian power supply. But with the development of the storage technologies and costs going down, as we can observe this have been happening over the past few years, I think the game will change dramatically, and the renewables will become one of the driving forces. Absolutely.
Let me add here a couple of general issues. One is what you said about the prices and that they were all undercapitalized. The prices are now at a reasonable cost plus level. They are not market prices, but they are reasonable. Previously, they were cost minus, and then you don't get any capital investment. So the fundamental precondition for investment has started in that regard. The second is that the banking system has collapsed, or half of it. And that was a good thing, because it had to be cleaned out, because these were simply crooked operations. And now it is the decent banks that remain. So there is another basis for expansion. And then I hope that EBRD and the IFC and other institutions will come in with the money. And then a third condition, which is not yet there, that's judicial reform. Property rights remain very weak in Ukraine, and they need to be reinforced. So I would emphasize these three elements. Two are done. One is supposed to be underway now. We'll see how far it succeeds. There was a question over there, yeah. And then here. Please. Yeah,
thank you very much. Bogdan Urbanovich, I'm D4 Energy Group. The company I work with is dealing with waste to energy. Waste to energy. And everybody is talking renewable. I think waste to my energy is a renewable energy. Nobody talks about that. In Ukraine, it's a big problem. The Ministry of Ecology in Ukraine, officially, 8% of the Ukrainian land is covered with waste. 8%. It's a huge problem, and you probably know about the Lviv, the collapse of the landfill. So we have lots of mayors asking us to build the waste to energy plant in Ukraine, but it's always the money. That's my question is to the EBRD, to Mrs. Small. Would you be interested in financing the waste to energy project? Same thing to DTEC. Maybe you would be interested, because you destroy waste and you produce electricity. It's win-win. It's ecology plus energy.
I think that both David and Michelle mentioned energy saving issues.
Exactly, and I think the way we would look at it is that you're saying that many mayors are wanting to buy this technology. So we would support that from the basis of the municipality and from the city view. So if there is such a project, again, it's bankable. So we're not an NGO. It needs to be bankable. It needs to be free of integrity issues. We'll certainly look at it, because that is a form of, energy efficiency, let's put it that way.
David,
I can say that if EBRD asks us to look at the project like that, we will gladly do so.
Look at that.
Yeah, we have a question here.
I'm not sure if this is pertinent. Sam Taylor, Energy and Resource Efficiency, former
Please
DOE,
go ahead.
Former DOE headquarters. When I was there at DOE, we worked very closely with EBRD in the energy efficiency, natural gas, and other areas. Okay. In the U.S., 3/4 of the electricity and over half the natural gas goes into the built environment, residential and commercial buildings. And I know EBRD plays a major role there. When you're looking at the total picture, you have to look at the demand and supply as part of your diversity package. I know that EBRD has a significant program there. Could you expand on this?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Is it energy efficiency in the built environment?
Yes, I know that EBRD has a major program in Ukraine, but it also impacts your balance, in terms of electricity as well as natural gas.
We have an overall target that I mentioned before, that all of our projects has to have this element of energy efficiency. So whatever type of project we look at, we measure the impact. So in the built environment, we look at things like credit lines to bank that give on-lend energy efficiency, residential loans. We look at, if we were to support a actual building, then that building has to be of a certain level in terms of either LEED measurement. So I don't know if that's what you were actually asking. You mean in terms of our own operations? I actually don't know the answer. I don't know whether we measure the sort of carbon. You're talking about like our carbon footprint around our office there?
Let me answer this, that Ukraine, before Maidan, used to import 35 billion cubic meters gas from Russia a year. Now the total imports last year were down to 12 billion cubic meters. So it's been a massive saving. Part of this is, of course, that some part has disappeared of the country, and part of it is that industry has declined. But the predominant factor is that gas prices per household went up by 11 times. And then people figure out how they can save. There was a lot of talk that people have to have meters first. Sorry, if they have to pay, then they make sure that they get meters so that they can defend themselves. So in 2015 alone, Ukraine's gas consumption fell by 20%. And given that we have not had proper measurements at house level before, this has been a great improvement. Prices work. People adjust to prices, and they make sure to protect themselves at high cost that they don't want to take on themselves. So the problem has turned out to be quite a bit the other way than people thought. People thought you need meters first, and then you can have prices. If you raise prices, you get meters. Vitaly?
Yeah, we touched on another interesting topic, which I believe also has to be part of the bigger discussion: energy efficiency. If you ask me, and I'm sharing you with insider, this is the next Klondike for Ukraine, because Ukrainian economy is highly inefficient. And you look at the residential, industrial, in terms of the historically. And this is the area where the new technologies can make the huge impact. And it's a very simple walk. You bring in, you save the energy, you collect money, and it's a win-win situation. For DTEC, in fact, last year we launched a company which will be exclusively focusing on developing the energy efficiency solutions for the residential and non-residential customers. And in my conversation with European counterparties, A lot of them who are also quite proficient in that on their respective domestic markets, there's a great deal of interest, and I think this is a growth area which yet to be explored, and that will most likely it will fit the profile of the financing for EBRD and even the private investments. This is something to keep in mind too.
Yes. Here, second row.
Bob Eichert, Atlantic Council, formerly State Department. Thank you all for the presentation. It was brought back a lot of memories for me, having worked in Ukraine for many years. And I mean, one of the perennial problems has been the revenue mobilization. And while you're right in the sense that the subsidy reforms have been enormous and very painful for the country in terms of the economy and where it stands, my sense is that the capital requirements of modernizing and replacing a lot of these assets are going to be enormous. And I'm still concerned that even though there was some privatization of the oblenergos, although it varies from country to company, that the distribution side is still an Achilles heel of the reform process. And in terms of both the efficiency issues that you're talking about, customer service, dealing with revenue collection and improving collection and service aspects. And I just wondered, is that proposition right? And what needs to be done? And is the tariff issues in terms of retail tariffs, does there need to be an overall reconsideration of that in light of the long-run marginal cost requirements of future investments?
I see another hand behind you there. So if we, in the blue shirt, if we take that question immediately, then we take the last answers here from the panel, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Brad Fisher with the DoD, and this is a general question. So the last panel, it was stated that Ukraine faces some uncertainty and transparency issues that could spook some potential energy investors. So with subversion and the weaponization of this uncertainty being tenets of the hybrid conflict that Ukrainians face, what can be done to protect the integrity of these energy ambitions and its energy future when there are many who would like to see it unrealized?
Thank you very much. What I would like to do now is to take these two questions, whoever wants to respond on the most before Vitaly. But I would also like to ask all of you, what are your greatest concern in your part of the energy sector in Ukraine for the next year or two? If we start with Vitaly.
Yeah, I'll try to give a brief answer for each of the questions and then end with the concerns. You're right on the distribution and general issue with the tariff. They're so disbalanced and did not necessarily provide a sustainable economic model. With regards to the distribution, I think there will be a further privatization of the remaining blocks. It's been discussed a potential introduction of the return on asset base system for the networks, and that would allow a more balanced economic model for them to going forward. What impact ultimately it will have on the end consumer tariff, so hard to estimate. Clearly they will go up, but as it was the case, rightly pointed out with the gas, it has to approach the market level, and it will probably all come together once the actual new market will start working, and then it will be balanced one way or the other. There will be shocks in the system, clearly, but as far as the concerns, and that sort of also touches on the preserving the integrity of the power system. Well, you have to bear in mind that back in 2014, there wasn't a single person who could make any bets as to what's going to happen. You know, the predictions were running amok as far as how long Ukrainian power sector will last, when the collapse is going to happen, whether it's coal, whether it's gas, whether it's nuclear. All and behold, today we're sitting and talking, in fact, about the future. And our biggest beef is how to make the investments a little bit more comfortable rather than survival issue. So in itself, that the resilience of Ukrainian power sector has been proven by the past several years. I don't believe there will be any significant further escalations which could seriously jeopardize the energy sector. The challenges that we are facing is, first and foremost, is clearly we need a market reform. I think to the extent that we will finally put a Chinese wall, using the bankers' terms, between the government and the power sector, then that will show that that will provide the necessary impetus and the space for the power sector to self-regulate, and that starts from investments, the tariffs, etc., etc. And this is the issue. Referring to the discussion we had during the lunch, where the politics could be separated from the power sector, what internally. If that could be achieved, and hopefully with the new market it will be achieved, and this is where the international community and U.S. in particular continuous pressure to ensure that this will be that magic pill, in my opinion.
David Muller, your last minute.
Well, I think my answer to all three questions is the one that Vitaly just gave. And the way I would summarize it is, I think what my biggest concern is sustained political will to complete the market reforms that have already been initiated. And I have to say, from my perspective, I'm relatively new at the game. I've been working with Ukraine for the last 2 years. Many of you have been working with Ukraine for decades, I know. But I am encouraged. So I've met with Roshman, I've met with the cabinet of ministers, I've met with a number of the ministers one-on-one, with the heads of the energy companies in Ukraine, and I see a real will to get things done. But my concern is that will is sustained. And I think if it is, and the reforms are completed, a lot of the other issues become, if not resolved, much more easily resolvable than they appear today. So.
Thank you.
And I think I second that. I was actually going to say the key to this is the effective reform. And reform is something that's not done overnight. It's a long slog. You have to stay on course. It's easy. It's also a disruptive sort of process, because you're going to have different parts of the community pulling you and pushing you. You have to stay on the road and don't stagnate. And I think my concern is the stagnation. It's not reversal, it's stagnation, because I think that's just as damaging. So it's slogging on, and that, I think, is the job of us, the IFIs and MBs, to keep on it. But we also need the support of, the US to put the pressure where it's needed, because if you take your foot off that brake, then I think things will really slow down.
Dr. Singh, the last word is yours.
Last word, okay. Well, only a few words. My concern in the near term, you phrased it near term, is Ukraine's energy infrastructure has gotten old. It is not in terribly good shape. And the margin to need to capacity, the actual output, is very small. And that's not a comfortable place for any country to be in. So, actually, we have sent a team out to Energoatom to see what we can do to make their nuclear plants more reliable, because of course the country depends on it so severely. But that is what concerns me about the country in the near term, 1 to 2 years. Of course, you folks addressed it over the longer term. But the country right now, it does need to deal with a gradual erosion of reliability of the power plants in the country. That is a problem. Nobody talks about, but it is a problem. You can see the capacity factor data, and you know that it's an issue that has to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. And perhaps I should just summarize in one word. I feel here a new sense of normalities, as I think particularly Vitaly here said about all of us. Thank you very much, all of you.
Wonderful.
And thank you.
Okay.